Protecting the Freedom of Jerusalem, featuring Ambassador Dore Gold of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, hosted by Hudson Bay Capital's Sander Gerber.
Got it. Hello, CPAC. It's a great honor to be able to introduce my very old and dear friend, Ambassador Dore Gold. Dore has filled most of the top foreign policy jobs in the state of Israel. He was foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu during his first term, where Dore served as an envoy to Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf states. He was also then Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, and most recently he served as the Director General of Israel's Foreign Ministry. Today, Dr. Gold leads the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, where I'm honored to be a fellow. The JCPA is one of Israel's premier think tanks, and Dore is its president. His book, The Fight for Jerusalem, was a New York Times bestseller and was read by senior members of several administrations. He combines the skills of an academic as well as a practitioner of diplomacy. His talk is entitled Protecting the Freedom of Israel, and I give him to you. Dore Gold.
Sander, thank you very much. And I thank CPAC for hosting us for this important message. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here. As all of you know, President Donald Trump honored a long-standing commitment that hadn't been fulfilled by previous administrations. It was the 1995 Jerusalem Embassy Act that was proposed by Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole back then, and Senate Minority Leader Tom Daschle. It was adopted by an overwhelming vote of 93-5. It called for American recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And it called for the establishment of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem as well. That was in 1995. This past year, it was President Donald Trump who finally moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Politicians make promises. Few of them actually fulfill them. President Trump did. I was privileged to be at the opening ceremony last May. I recalled in 1999 when I was Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, and I sought instructions from my foreign minister, who was Ariel Sharon, about how to respond to a Palestinian initiative against the state of Israel at the UN. I wanted instructions. Sharon told me to read over the speech of Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, from 1949, in which he announced in the Knesset that he was moving Israel's capital to Jerusalem. He declared that the people of Israel had, quote, faithfully honored for 2,500 years the oath sworn by the first exiles by the rivers of Babylon not to forget Jerusalem. Today, even before President Trump announced his intention to relocate the U.S. embassy in Israel, an intense diplomatic struggle has been waged regarding Jerusalem's ultimate fate. Jerusalem was under assault in all the main United Nations bodies over the past 15 or 20 years, propped up by that organization's notorious bloc voting. Within days of President Trump's announcement, the UN General Assembly convened to oppose the move. This was the latest action taken at the UN to replace historical truth with fake history in order to advance a hostile diplomatic agenda against the State of Israel. During the next 15 minutes, we will look at that hostile agenda in order to understand what it is trying to do. For example, in 2016, UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Science, and Culture Organization, asserted that the Temple Mount was connected to Islam. But UNESCO refused to acknowledge any Jewish connection whatsoever, or for that matter, any Christian connection. In its resolution, it used only the Islamic terms for the area, namely the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Haram al-Sharif. The words Temple Mount were completely missing in that UN document of UNESCO. Israel's adversaries and their allies took their campaign to the UN Security Council as well, with the infamous Resolution 2334, adopted in December 2016 during the transition period in Washington between the outgoing Obama administration and the incoming Trump administration. By yet again branding Jerusalem as, quote, occupied Palestinian territory, the UN was insinuating that Israel had no standing in Jerusalem and that its old city, the Temple Mount, and even the Western Wall were Palestinian. Apart from the UN, another front to try to be used to erode Israel's ties to Jerusalem opened in July of 2000, when the PLO leader Yasser Arafat stated at the Camp David summit that there never was a temple in Jerusalem. Arafat had said, "There is nothing there." His loyalists would go on to say, "You know what? Go prove there was a temple." But President Clinton, to his credit, responded, quote, "Not only the Jews, but I too believe that under the surface there are remains of Solomon's temple," unquote. What Clinton did not have to spell out was that the temple was also significant for Christianity. By the way, just go read the New Testament. It's right there. Denying its history entailed an affront to the Christian faith as well as the Jewish faith. Now, what did the UN resolutions on Jerusalem actually do? They legitimized doubt beyond the walls of the UN to the mass media and to academia. You see, words really do matter. The New York Times entitled an article in October 2015, "Historical Certainty Proves Elusive at Jerusalem's Holiest Place." Now, what does elusive mean? This isn't an SAT test. What does it mean, elusive? What elusive means is it's hard to prove. Professor Juan Cole of the prestigious University of Michigan argued in 2010, quote, archaeology does not show the existence of a Jewish kingdom in Jerusalem, unquote. No kingdom, no temple, no historical connection for Israel. Is all that true? Well, here's the answer. These are royal seals from the kings of Judah. They were found at the foot of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They all carry the names of biblical kings of Judah and some of their descendants in ancient Hebrew. This one here is the seal of King Hezekiah, who we call in Hebrew Chezkiyahu HaMelech. He was a direct descendant of King David, and here's his royal seal. So guess what? There were Jewish kings in Jerusalem. Contrary to what may have been said at the University of Michigan. Now, does anyone in the audience here read ancient Greek? Well, watch this then. This 2,000-year-old stone found next to the Temple Mount is an original signpost in ancient Greek marking the rules of entry to the temple in Jerusalem. The stone on the left is from the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. You can go to the Israel Museum and you can see it. But the full text of the Greek inscription, which we've transcribed here, is from the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul. It makes specific reference to the temple precincts. You remember what Arafat's lieutenant said? Go prove it. The word highlighted in orange on the right, hieron, is ancient Greek for the word, it's the ancient Greek word for temple. Let's go fast forward to the year 70 of the Common Era. The Roman Empire sent the Roman general Titus to march on the kingdom of Judah. Titus, who went on to become emperor, Caesar of Rome, vanquished Judah, conquered Jerusalem, and destroyed the temple. You see here the boulders toppled by the Roman legions, which tell the tale of that destruction to this day. You know, the Romans did not have Polaroid cameras or CNN, but to celebrate their victory over the Jews and the Christians, they created this relief, which you can see if you visit Rome and go to the Arch of Titus. It's right around the corner from the Colosseum. You can see the Roman soldiers carrying the sacred treasures looted from the temple in a victory march. You see the menorah there, which was one of the items which they stole. You know, people today might wonder, what is all this fuss about the temple? In the Bible, the temple's construction was the only event dated in relation to the Exodus from Egypt, 480 years earlier. The temple was where the 2 tablets with the 10 commandments were stored, were housed. Therefore, the temple symbolized freedom and national identity. The Romans did not manage to snuff out the will for freedom, which we talk about so much in this conference. Some 60 years after the temple's destruction, a Judean general named Bar Kokhba rose up in rebellion and fought 6 Roman legions. His letters have been discovered in the Judean desert, like this one here. Bar Kokhba stated the goal of his campaign on coins that were minted at the time and not long ago just found. You know what they call for? the Bar Kokhba coins, for the freedom of Jerusalem, Lama'an Cherut Yerushalayim. Speaking of the Romans, one last historical fact before we continue. After crushing the Bar Kokhba revolt in the year 135, the Roman occupiers decided to annihilate all Jewish hope for freedom. They feared that freedom would be contagious and revolts would certainly spread across the Roman Empire, in Germany, in Gaul, in Africa. So they renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina, and they also gave the land of Judea a new name, Syria Palestina. This is the actual origin of the name Palestine. This was a Roman deceit, an attempt to erase Judea from the world's consciousness. You know what? That was the methodology then, and that is also the methodology today, attacking our very identity. Today it's called the D Legitimization of Israel, and it lies at the heart of the BDS movement. You know, BDS is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. But that movement is there to tear at our identity and the legitimacy of our cause. So let me just tell you something. Clearly, the Roman effort didn't work then, and we're not going to let it work now. The drive for freedom survived 19 centuries, even after Bar Kokhba's army was crushed at Beitar by Imperial Rome. Thousands streamed back whenever they could. Yet there are those who claim that the rebirth of Israel represents a foreign colonialist implant. The facts show otherwise. By the mid-19th century, the British consulate in Jerusalem determined, according to this diplomatic cable, that Jews had already restored their majority in Jerusalem in 1863. It's the time of the American Civil War. Long before Theodore Herzl, the British arrival, or the establishment of the State of Israel. We were back. And this gentleman here is William Seward, President Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. He was the guy who bought Alaska for you. In 1870, he completed his term in office in Washington, and he visited Jerusalem. And his memoirs, which you can read today, showed that he understood that there was a Jewish majority in Jerusalem in 1870. You cannot attach the Jewish return to Jerusalem that occurred in the 19th century, and even earlier, to the European colonialist locomotive. Let's go fast forward to 1948. The newly proclaimed State of Israel found itself attacked by 5 Arab armies. By the way, they were assisted by the colonial powers. The old city of Jerusalem was besieged. Its Jewish population was ethnically cleansed. As you can see on the left, this is the Jewish population rushing through the Zion Gate to protect themselves as artillery shells and bullets of the Arab Legion were being fired. Israelis were prevented from visiting their holy sites. And what you can see on the right is the bombardment of the Porat Yosef Yeshiva in the Old City, in the Jewish quarter. That is what happened to our holy sites, and that's something to keep in mind for the present tense. Now, while the United Nations proposed to internationalize the city, internationalize Jerusalem, the UN back in 1947, 48, 49, didn't lift a finger to stop the wanton destruction that went on. Let's move forward to May 1967. Israel was encircled again. In Israeli-controlled Jerusalem, 6,000 buildings were hit by Jordanian artillery. But despite those very difficult conditions, and despite being outnumbered, Israel prevailed, liberating and reuniting the city. These are the Israeli paratroopers at the Western Wall in June 1967. Today, military threats have not ended. Across the Middle East, the holy sites of all the great faiths are under a new assault by the forces of jihad. In Afghanistan, 2,000-year-old Buddhist statues were destroyed by the Taliban. In Syria, the legacies of thousands of years were destroyed by ISIS, that's Al-Qaeda in Iraq. In Egypt, Coptic churches burned and their worshipers were killed. Across the entire region, Christians are persecuted and driven from their homes. You know what? Even mosques are destroyed by the same violent intolerance. Right next to Israel, joint forces of the Palestinian Fatah movement and Hamas invaded the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus, in 2002, which you can see here. You can see the smoke rising, desecrating it and taking its clergy as hostage. Here you see the tomb of the biblical Joseph in Nablus, in the city which we call Shechem, which was overrun by mobs carrying hammers and crowbars to dismantle the tomb. What is clear today, more than ever before, is that the only force that will protect Jerusalem for all the great faiths is the modern state of Israel. Israel has not forgotten how its enemies sought to forcibly cut its connection with the holy city in the past. It should come as no surprise that according to a 2017 poll ordered by my center, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, from Israel's leading pollster, Mina Tzemach, 79% of Israelis believe it is important to retain a unified Jerusalem. What they are saying is basically, Jerusalem is not for sale. I mean, that is the applause line. Now, Israel has fended off physical assaults on Jerusalem, and it will continue to defend itself. But I want to remind you, and it isn't bragging, that we are an important ally for the United States. Here you have, in the New York Times of all places, you have the head of U.S. Air Force military intelligence being quoted in 1986 that Israel is worth 5 CIAs. No offense to anybody. But the main point is this: we never ask your sons and daughters to come to defend us. You have big American contingents in Europe, in NATO. You have big American contingents in Korea. We want to defend ourselves by ourselves. and that is Israeli military doctrine. But we do need your help for one thing, to help us defeat the diplomatic assaults against that Israel and that Jerusalem faces even today. We need your help to fight fake history. We need your help to fight for the truth. The founding fathers of this country, the United States of America, studied the Bible. And they learned what freedom meant. With the rebirth of Israel in 1948, we learned it back from you. We are bound by our common love of liberty. And you want to know something for CPAC? That is part of what makes America great. The love of liberty must be based on truth, not temple denial. Israel's ancestors fought for the freedom of Jerusalem. That's what the holiday of Hanukkah is all about, that we celebrate in December. And that's what this coin from the Bar Kokhba revolt attests. Looking at this history, freedom must never be taken for granted, but faithfully protected by every generation. That's what America has done, and that's what Israel will do as well. Thank you.